Hello, my name is Cheryl Mathis. I am a low incidence consultant for Kentucky Valley Educational Cooperative. Today, I will briefly discuss resources for evidence based practices for children, youth, and young adults with autism. There are currently 27 evidence based practices that have been scientifically researched to be effective for children, youth, and young adults with autism, as noted on your screen. Additional evidence based practices are occasionally added as new research becomes available. The current list was last updated in 2014. When implemented correctly, these evidence based practices contribute to positive outcomes for students with autism. I have included the working definitions for each evidence-based practice as defined by the National Professional Development Center on Autism Spectrum Disorders. This 3-page document is especially handy when discussing intervention strategies with families. This document is available for download. It's time for a review question. How many evidence-based practices do we currently have for children, youth, and young adults with autism? A, 18, B, 25, C, 27, or D, 32? The answer is C. There are currently 27 evidence-based practices for children, youth, and young adults with autism. It is sometimes challenging to identify what evidence-based practices to implement to best meet your students' individual needs. I have included a matrix developed by the National Professional Development Center on Autism Spectrum Disorders for the purpose of narrowing down the evidence-based practices that apply. The matrix is available for download. Please take a moment to print the matrix by outcome and age. You may pause the video if you need extra time. Take a few minutes to review the matrix by outcome and age. Grab a highlighter and consider what evidence-based practices you are implementing within your classroom. Assess your implementation level of each of the highlighted practices. Remember, pause the video if you need more time. Last, consider what evidence-based practices you may want to investigate further or need to improve upon in your classroom. Let's take a moment to consider how we could use this matrix for identifying appropriate evidence-based practices for a student named Johnny. Johnny is a 6-year-old nonverbal student with autism. His team has expressed concern for Johnny's communication skills. I can review the matrix to identify what evidence-based practices, when implemented correctly, contribute to positive outcomes in the area of communication for children with autism. I go directly to the communication column, as highlighted here by the red arrow. I narrow the search to the 6 through 14 age range, as highlighted here by the red arrow. There are multiple practices to choose from based on Johnny's age and desired outcome of communication, represented here by the green highlighted cells. There are 26 evidence-based practices to choose from to target communication outcomes. The only practice not scientifically identified to yield positive communication outcomes for 6-year-olds with autism is exercise. Implementation of 26 identified evidence-based practices for Johnny may not always be feasible, specifically if Johnny's classroom doesn't have any of these evidence-based practices currently in place. My suggestion is to select 1 or 2 evidence-based practices that are suitable for individualized student needs and implement them correctly. I often find that implementing 1 or 2 evidence-based practices correctly yields far more results than implementing 26 evidence-based practices incorrectly. You can always implement additional evidence-based practices as you become more comfortable with implementation. I often say, if you try to eat an elephant all in one bite, you will get choked. But if you try it in small pieces, you can eat it all without getting choked. It will take more time, but you will yield far more results if you take the time to implement correctly. Let's consider what practices you have implemented within your classroom. I have introduced the process of identifying evidence-based practices for Johnny. Let's say you have decided to implement the Picture Exchange Communication System, otherwise known as PECS. The only barrier is you don't have a clue how to implement PECS. Professional learning opportunities are easily accessible online. Online professionalized learning options are often overlooked as an option for professional development. However, online training options offer learning that is not bound by time or place. There are 2 free resources that I would like to share with you that focus on professional learning. First, the National Professional Development Center on Autism Spectrum Disorder is a free resource that contains a general overview for each evidence-based practice and step-by-step procedures for implementation. Online modules called Affirm modules are also available for free on this site. The modules typically take about 2 hours each to complete. These modules focus on planning, using, and monitoring implementation of the evidence-based practice. The next free resource is the Autism Internet modules. These modules are for learning more about evidence-based practices. You will notice that modules contained within this site extend beyond evidence-based practice for autism. To access the modules, you must set up an account and log in. There is an option of receiving graduate credit for completing these modules. Please answer this true or false question. Online training for evidence-based practices for autism are often hard to find. The answer is false. Online training for evidence-based practices for autism are very easy to access and are free in many cases. In addition, face-to-face training on evidence-based practices for autism occur on a regular basis at Kentucky Valley Educational Cooperative. For your next step, I would recommend identifying an evidence-based practice that you would like to utilize within your classroom, then accessing the online training for the evidence-based practice. After training, your next step is implementation. References used within this presentation are listed here. Thanks for watching, and good luck implementing evidence-based practices into your classroom.